Hey World History, got a heck of a lesson for you today. I'm sorry it's so late. This morning was a little nuts, not in a very good way, but everyone's okay, and so we're all good. So today we are going to travel to England in the 1600s and learn about quite the adventure that the Tudors left behind when Elizabeth I died with no children. So, what happens when a monarch dies with no children? Well, she has to find another relative to pass the crown to. But first, let's talk about Elizabeth, her family, the Tudors. So, you know the Tudors because Henry VIII was a Tudor. He's the one with 6 wives, 3 kids, all that good stuff. So the Tudors worked with, not against, Parliament. So remember, Parliament is a congressional-like body, but it's not like Congress in that it doesn't actually make laws. You need congressional approval to do certain things in England because of the Magna Carta, because the revolt of the barons, and how they forced King John to sign it, taking power away from the monarchy. But monarchs in England still have a decent amount of power. From 1485 to 1603, England was ruled by the Tudors. Okay. It was 3 generations, 5 different monarchs. You started with Henry VII, who was the guy with all the wives' dad. He passes on his power to Henry VIII, remember, who wasn't supposed to be king because his older brother was supposed to. And then Henry VIII, each of Henry VIII's 3 children got it their turn to be the leader of England because none of them ever had kids. So you had Edward, who was young. He became king at the age of 12, 11, I think, and was very sickly. Then you had Mary, Bloody Mary, who, despite being old enough to have children and despite being married to Philip II, who was that super powerful Spanish monarch, never had any children. Then you had Elizabeth, who chose never to get married. And so, when she passed away, they had to sort of pass on the crown to someone else. But while they were in power, they recognized the value of good relations with Parliament. Henry VIII broke from the Catholic Church, but he turned to Parliament to legalize his actions. So if Parliament said he could do it, technically he could. Parliament approved the Act of Supremacy, which made King Henry head of the Church of England. A constant need for money also led Henry to consult Parliament because despite the fact that his dad, Henry VII, was really good with money, Henry VIII was not. And so he quickly used his funds fighting overseas wars. If you want to levy taxes, you have to get the approval of Parliament. Members of Parliament tended to vote with Henry, but they got used to being consulted on important matters. So even though Parliament didn't usually disagree, they enjoyed being wanted. When Elizabeth I gained the throne, she too both consulted and controlled Parliament. Her advisors conveyed the Queen wishes to Parliament, forbade discussion of certain subjects, so they weren't allowed to talk about foreign policy, they weren't allowed to talk about her getting married, but her skill in handling Parliament made her a very popular and successful ruler. She was known as Good Queen Bess. But Elizabeth died childless, like we said, in 1603. Her heir was her relative James Stuart, the ruling king of Scotland. The Stuarts were neither as popular as the Tudors nor as skillful in dealing with Parliament. They also inherited problems that Henry and Elizabeth had kept at bay or chosen not to deal with. Okay, so now you have the Stuarts who've inherited this, and you sort of have the Century of Revolution, which is really mostly Stuart monarchs versus Parliament. So the Stuarts issued a challenge. The first Stuart monarch, James I, had agreed to rule England according to English laws and customs. But soon he was lecturing Parliament about divine right, which is that whole thing where God made me king, so I can do whatever I want because God made me king. Leaders in the House of Commons fiercely resisted the king's claim to absolute power. So James is seeing how Philip was able to take absolute power in Spain and how Louis XIV was able to take absolute power in France, and he's wanting this. Well, technically Louis was after him, but you get the idea. He's wanting this absolute power that other nations in Europe have. And so James is repeatedly clashing with Parliament over money and over foreign policy. He needs funds to pay for his court, which he kept very nicely decorated, and to wage wars. when members wanted to discuss foreign policy before voting funds, James dissolved Parliament and collected taxes on his own, which was something he should not have done. So he basically said, I don't want y'all here, go home, I'm going to do this on my own, which is not what's supposed to happen. James also clashed with dissenters. So dissenters are Protestants who differed with the Church of England. One group called the Puritans sought to purify the church of Catholic practices. Puritans called for simpler services, a more democratic church without bishops. James rejected their demands and started to persecute them. So the Puritans, remember how when Henry converted the Church of England, he wanted to change the name more than he wanted to actually change the practices, because he really liked being able to pay to have his sins saved, because that meant he didn't actually have to be a good person. He just had to give some money to the church and then all was forgiven. So there were still a lot of Catholic type practices, and the Puritans were against that, and many other things, like fun. And so you've got your dissenters, such as the Puritans, and he's clashing with them. And Parliament responds. But James manages to make it through his reign without anything too bad. No, people don't like him that much. He doesn't do that great of a job ruling, but he manages to suppress Parliament for long enough. And in 1625, Charles I inherits the throne. And this is where things start to not go well. Like his father James, Charles came in wanting to behave like an absolute monarch. I am in control. And he imprisoned his foes without trial. He squeezed the nation for money. But by 1628, his need to raise taxes forced him to summon Parliament. Before voting any funds, Parliament insisted that Charles sign the Petition of Right. The petition prohibited the king from raising taxes without Parliament's consent, and it also prohibited the king from jailing anyone without legal justification. So they basically said, you can't throw these people in jail just because you don't like them. And Charles did sign the petition, but then he dissolved Parliament. And then for the next 11 years, completely ignored Parliament, ignored the petition, continued to raise taxes, continued to jail people without legal cause. And during this time, he created very bitter enemies. His Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, tried to force all the clergy to follow strict Anglican rules. He would dismiss or imprison anybody who disagreed with him, and many people felt that the Archbishop was trying to bring back Catholicism, which the English did not want at all. And in 1637, Charles and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Laud, tried to impose the Anglican prayer book on Scotland. Scotland is Calvinist, and they were not okay with it. They actually rebelled. And to get funds to suppress the Scottish rebellion, Charles was forced to summon Parliament for the first time in 11 years. When it met, though, Parliament was not happy, and they were not, under any circumstances, going to be dismissed again. This guy, they'd finally forced him to sign something that would check his power, and then he dissolved them and ignored it and all the rules for 11 years, and was just acting like a tyrant. They finally had an opportunity to do something, and they weren't about to let Charles get away with anything. So 1640 became known as the Long Parliament because it was never actually dissolved for 13 years. Now, they weren't in session all the time, but they were essentially in session for 13 years. Its actions triggered the greatest political revolution in English history. In a mounting struggle with Charles I, Parliament is now putting on trial and executing some of Charles's chief ministers, including Archbishop Laud. So they're able to directly go against the king. Parliament is gaining enough power to execute people that the king has put in place. It called for the abolition of bishops, declared that Parliament could not be dissolved unless Parliament was okay with being dissolved. And Lord only knows Parliament was not going to be okay with that. Charles lashed back. In 1642, 2 years later, he led troops into the House of Commons and tried to arrest them. They escaped through a back door and soon raised their own army, and all of a sudden, England was at war. So you have this civil war that lasts from 1642 to 1651, although some historians will disagree on these specific years. Like the Fronde that occurred around the same time in France, the English Civil War is this major challenge to absolutism. But while the forces of royal power won in France, in England the forces of revolution actually triumphed. So you had kind of two sides. At first, the odds seemed to favor the supporters of Charles I, who were the Cavaliers. So they supported Charles I. So that's your one side. Many Cavaliers were wealthy nobles, very proud of their plumed hats and fashionably long hair. Well trained in dueling and warfare, the Cavaliers expected a quick victory. But their foes proved to be tough fighters with the courage of what they were fighting for. The forces of Parliament were composed of the country gentry, your town dwelling manufacturers, and your Puritan clergy. They were called the Roundheads because their hair was cut close around their heads. So you have the Cavaliers versus the Roundheads. So this is your gentry, manufacturers, and your Puritan clergy. So, the Roundheads found a leader of genius in a guy named Oliver Cromwell. A Puritan member of the lesser gentry, Cromwell proved himself to be a skilled general. He organized what was called the New Model Army for Parliament, made up of officers selected for skill rather than social class. How many times throughout history have we seen people succeed when they select people based on skill rather than by social class? And it works again. So Cromwell puts together this new model army and starts to defeat the Cavaliers in a series of decisive battles. By 1647, the king is in the hand of parliamentary forces. Okay? So, Roundhead leader, RH leader, Oliver Cromwell. And your new model army. Alright, so eventually Parliament set up a court to put the king on trial because the Roundheads, with Oliver Cromwell leading, had succeeded in capturing the king. And so basically they put the king on trial. This is a huge deal. The normal people are not supposed to be able to put a king on trial, okay? And actually, they not only found him guilty for tyranny, treason, murder, and being an enemy of the public, but they condemned him to death. On a cold January day in 1649, Charles I stood on a scaffold surrounded by his foes. He said, "I am a martyr of the people." The king told the executioner that he would give the sign for the strike. After a brief prayer, Charles knelt, placed his neck on the block. On the agreed signal, the executioner chopped off his head. The execution sent shock waves throughout Europe. I mean, imagine Charles I is executed. Think about how all the other monarchs feel. Now they thought, oh no, if I do something that people don't like, they can arrest me, put me on trial, and execute me. This is not a good thing for the monarchy. The parliamentary forces that said basically in England, no ruler has absolute power. You have to obey the law, even if you're the king. And so what happens after that? There's no king. So the House of Commons abolished the monarchy, the House of Lords, and the establishment of the Church of England. They just get rid of everything all in one go. They declared England a republic known as the Commonwealth, and their leader was none other than Oliver Cromwell. Okay? So you've got the Commonwealth, and it's a republic. One of the first of its kind in Europe. And there were challenges to it. The new government faced many, many threats. Supporters of Charles II, who was the uncrowned heir to the throne, Charles I's son, attacked England by way of Ireland and Scotland. Cromwell led forces into Ireland and brutally crushed the uprising. He then took harsh measures against the Irish Catholic majority that are still vividly remembered today. Irish Catholics in England are still bitter about this 400 years later. In 1652, Parliament passed a law exiling Catholics to the west of Ireland. Any Catholic found disobeying this order could be killed on sight. So there were strict laws against Catholics. Which is interesting because in most other countries the laws are against Protestants, like in Spain and France. But in England it was against Catholics. Squabbles also splintered forces within the Commonwealth. One group called the Levellers thought that the poor man should have as much say as the gentry, lawyers, and other leading citizens. They said, basically, female Levellers asserted their right to petition Parliament. These ideas horrified the gentry. Poor people can't be included. And Cromwell suppressed the Levelers as well as other more radical groups. In 1653, because the challenges are growing, Cromwell took the title of Lord Protector and actually becomes a dictator. So he rules by power of the army. Okay? So you have laws against Catholics, you have the Leveler rebelling, and in 1653, yes, Cromwell equals Lord Protector, aka dictator. So now he's in charge and no one can check his power. The Puritans. So let's talk about what they were doing. The Puritans, with their goal of rooting out godlessness, gained a new voice. So this actually starts a social revolution too. Parliament enacts this series of laws designed to make sure that Sunday was set aside for religious observances. Anyone over the age of 14 who was caught profaning the Lord's Day could be fined. To the Puritans, theaters were frivolous. So Puritans also frowned on taverns, gambling, and dancing. So Cromwell actually closed all theaters. I know, all my theater kids, we're furious. Puritans felt that every Christian, rich or poor, must be able to read the Bible, so they're actually encouraging education for all. Puritans pushed for changes in marriage to ensure greater fidelity, which is promises to each other and loyalty to each other. In addition to marriages based on business interests, they encouraged marriage based on love, which wasn't common. But women were usually still seen as subordinate to men. Although Cromwell did not tolerate open worship by Roman Catholics, he did believe in religious freedom for other Protestant groups, so he actually welcomed Jews back to England for the first time in over 300 years. But Oliver Cromwell dies in 1658. Soon after, the Puritans lose their grip on England. In 1660, a newly elected parliament actually wrote to Charles II, the son of the guy that they executed, and asked him to come back and be king again. England's kingless decade ended with the Restoration, or return of the monarchy. Okay, so you have the Restoration, which was when the monarchy came back. But it didn't end there. We do have a tiny bit more left to cover. Okay, so I'm going to erase this so you kind of got a chance to see it. You can pause it if you need to. And now I'm going to erase it and go on. It is a longer lesson, but a lot's happening in England. Okay? Hang in there. I know you guys are doing so great. You can pause, you can walk away, get a drink of water if you need to. Take a break. But let's finish up. Where are we? Yes, May 1660. Cheering crowds welcome Charles II back. So Charles II was charming, and he was witty, and he was a popular ruler. He reopened theaters and taverns. And presided over a lively court. Although Charles accepted the Petition of Right, he still shared his father's belief in absolute monarchy. However, he wasn't dumb enough to try and assert power over everybody. So he avoided the mistakes. Charles's brother James II inherited the throne in 1685. Unlike Charles, James practiced his Catholic faith. Hello, we just passed all these laws saying that Catholics could be killed on sight. And now we have a Catholic king? I don't think so. And the people of England didn't think so either. He angered his subject by suspending laws on whim, appointing Catholics to high office. English Protestants feared that he would restore the Roman Catholic Church. In 1688, parliamentary leaders invited James's daughter, Mary, who was Protestant, and her Dutch Protestant husband, William, and they wrote to them, and they said, hey, can you come and be king and queen instead of your dad, because we don't like him? And they said, okay. So they gathered an army and they landed in 1688 with their army. But James II immediately ran away. So it was completely bloodless. It was called the Glorious Revolution because there was no bloodshed. So James II ran away as soon as William and Mary. So William III and Mary II. So because Mary was James's daughter, she was queen, but she did crown William as king, so they ruled together. Before they could be crowned, though, they had to accept the English Bill of Rights. The English did not want everything happening again that had happened before. It required the monarchy to summon Parliament regularly. It gave the House of Commons the power of the purse, so it said that the common people, not the peasants, but like the not historically wealthy people, could control spending, royal spending. A king or queen could no longer interfere in parliamentary debates, and it also said no Catholic can ever sit on the throne. The Bill of Rights restated the traditional rights, so like trial by jury, no cruel and unusual punishment, no excessive fines. A lot of our constitutional rights come from the English Bill of Rights. Habeas corpus, you can't be arrested and held in jail without being charged with a specific crime. And Catholics, though, were allowed no religious freedom. But it did create a limited monarchy. So it's not a democracy, but it was a limited monarchy. So we're almost done. Constitutional government. Let's talk about that. So, constitutional government, specifically, is a government whose power is defined and limited by law. That means that no matter who you are, you can't break the law. Before this, kings or queens could break the law however they wanted, but now you have to obey the law. This is where political parties emerge. We have the Tories, and we have the Whigs. The Tories were generally aristocrats. The Whigs, though back to they were more like urban business interests. They also create something called the cabinet system, named after the small room in which they met. The cabinet is going to be like leaders and parliamentary advisors to help the king. It started with George I became king because George I spoke no English. None. He was king of England, and he couldn't speak English. So he needed advisors. That was where the cabinet comes from. We have a cabinet. Now, over time, the head of the cabinet came to be known as the Prime Minister. This person was always the leader of the majority party in the House of Commons. Eventually, the Prime Minister became the chief official of the British government. From 1721 to 1742, able Whig leader Robert Walpole molded the cabinet into a unified body by requiring all members to agree on major issues. Although the title was not yet in use, Walpole was frequently called Britain's first Prime Minister. Other countries later adopted this cabinet-type system, including us. Now, England is still more of an oligarchy, which is a society ruled by the few, not by the many. And in Britain, landowning aristocracies were still believed to be the natural ruling class, so it's still noble, it's still aristocratic. Most Britons didn't have the wealth or the privilege and lived very poorly, but a relatively stable middle class is growing, and this is happening all throughout Europe. All right, so that's pretty much the end. This is actually where we lead almost from here into the Industrial Revolution, so this really takes us up to more modern looking times. Thanks for hanging in there, you guys. I know this was a longer lesson. Hopefully it was at least a little lively for you. But yeah, you do have a Junopod, but because this is out so late, you will have until midnight on Friday to complete that, all right? So good luck. Hang in there, and you guys are awesome. I miss you. And reminder, if you write me a theme song, you will get extra credit. Bye.